This afternoon it's my great privilege to welcome someone who I think has been at almost every summer course that we've ever had, haven't you, Ernan? I think Ernan is one of the real continuities in these summer courses. So Ernan McMullin was at the University of Notre Dame for many years, for decades actually. He was the Professor of Philosophy and Director of the program in the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Notre Dame, and has written very widely in the whole science religion area, as well, of course, as many aspects of history, including some very important works about Galileo. I don't think, or maybe you will be speaking about Galileo this afternoon, but I do recommend those. For those interested in the Galileo affair, there's a wonderful Faraday paper. If you haven't come across the Faraday papers, this is a series of papers you can get free off the web, or you can buy a whole pack of them. I think you get there's some free offer going to happen in the book shop tomorrow, and so I do recommend Ernan's paper on that. Professor McMullin actually goes back to when he was studying physics and theology, and we found this in Dublin when he was speaking a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about these sort of historical figures in the history of science, and of course it turns out Professor McMullin was taught by them, or knew them, or had spoken with Schrödinger and was taught by Georges Lemaitre at the University of Louvain in Belgium and so on. So is really a living, walking encyclopedia of historical knowledge of the history and philosophy of science of the 20th century, and has actually been the president of all the four major philosophical associations in the United States. I don't think there's anyone else who's quite lived long enough to fulfill that. So we're delighted that Ernan's speaking with us this afternoon on an intriguing title, which I don't really know what's going to be about, so we will find out. Darwin and the Other Christian Tradition. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Dennis. Well, I'm very glad to be back on the Faraday fold again. As Dennis said, I've been with it now since the series began, and before that, actually, to the other series in Oxford, in Peter's home. Anyway, the topic I have today, I call it Darwin and the Other Christian Tradition. In the television program Darwin and the Tree of Life, which appeared about a year ago, David Attenborough, who needs no introduction from me, opens an ornate Bible, large, in a stand like this, and he quotes the familiar opening lines of Genesis and intones the story of God's creation of the diversity of living things over a period of 3 days, from the 4th to the 6th of the 6 days. That, he says, and I quote here, is the Bible's explanation of how that wonderful diversity came about, and it was believed literally by pretty well all of Western Europe for the best part of 2,000 years. Now, I suspect that most of the listeners to that program, and possibly even a few here, although I'm sure that would be the exception here, would assent to that. He's expressing a belief that indeed is widely shared. But is it in fact correct? Well, I'm going to argue today that it is not correct. There was a quite different way of reading the Genesis account of creation in the early and medieval church, one that was gradually more or less from sight. That part of the story, the losing from sight, will be at the end of my talk, and I won't have as much time as I would like to develop that. But one, as it happens, this other tradition would have made the appearance of Darwin's Origin of Species seem more like a culmination than a surprise. Well, at the beginning, theologians of the early church were struck by the way in which the first verses of Genesis describe the origins of living things. God said, "Let the earth bring forth nourishing crops. Let the waters bring forth living creatures. Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." It seemed as though the Creator had, in the work of the 6 days, conferred successively upon water and earth the power to bring forth all of the living kinds. The great theologians of the early church, Basil, John Chrysostom, and Ambrose, made much of those remarkable verses, testifying to the mighty powers of God, though they did not say so. The bringing forth from their point of view on a single day would clearly have been miraculous in their eyes. It would not have been part of the processes that would constitute what later came to be called the order of nature. In his apologetic treatise on the Hexameron, one of the greatest of the Greek fathers, Gregory of Nyssa carried this thought a crucial stage further. Instead of a successive conferring of new powers, would not a transcendent creator have imparted those powers from the beginning? The successive appearances of the different kinds, living kinds, testify rather to potentialities that were already there from the moment of creation to mature at the proper time when water and earth would be right. Now, the handout. The sources, this is Gregory, the sources, causes, and potentialities of all things were collectively sent forth in an instant. And in this first impulse of the divine will, the essences of all things were assembled together. Heaven, ether, star, fire, air, sea, earth, animal, plant. There followed a certain necessary series according to a certain order. That's the order of nature. Not by chance, but as the necessary arrangement of nature requires succession in the things coming into being. Gregory's imaginative construal of the bringing forth, so heavily emphasized in the biblical text, was prompted primarily by a growing appreciation of what creation ex nihilo, from nothing, amounted to. It was just in those years that that particular doctrine was coming to fruition. It was not present actually in the early church, but so it, from his point of view, the creation is the drawing forth of what was contained in seed-like potency. That's Gregory's own term from the beginning. Going to Augustine, who is the main figure in my talk, Augustine took the problem of interpreting the Genesis account of creation very seriously. One immediate reason was that his erstwhile Manichaean colleagues, in their attack on Christian belief, focused mainly on those chapters. Their own opposing doctrine of two warring cosmic principles, light and darkness, led them to scoff at the story of the 6 days, simplistic as they saw it. Even before his ordination to the priesthood, Augustine composed a 2-volume work, the De Genesi contra Manichaeos, in which he resorted to allegory when literal interpretation quite defeated him. Dissatisfied with that result, he tried again a few years later, this time aiming at a literal interpretation, and failed once again, leaving the work unfinished. It's called the De Genesi et Litteram Imperfectus Liber, Imperfectus, unfinished. Finally, in the year 401, he began again and labored over 14 years to compose the classic work, De Genesi et Litteram, the literal meaning of Genesis, as it's called now in English, finding a very different way to approach the puzzling texts. The word literal in his title could mislead the modern reader. For Augustine, the term signified the meaning that the author intended. That was what it meant for him. In some contexts, this might be literal in our sense. In others, it might be metaphorical, or a parable, for example. In this work, he hoped that he had hit upon the meaning that the author, for him, God, and the human author taken together, must have intended, though he was willing to allow that others might disagree with him. He was helped in this by the earlier interpretations of the puzzling Genesis text by his predecessors, but he went well beyond these and the imaginative power and persuasive force of his presentation. He saw clearly that the first chapter of Genesis could not be taken literally in our sense, not his. As both critics, like the Manichaeans, and the defenders, people like Ambrose and so on, had already noted, the days in which the narrative is organized could not possibly be days in the normal sense, as Augustine emphasizes. The day of creation, Augustine notes, again the handout, is not to be taken in the sense of our day, which we reckon by the course of the sun, but it must have another meaning applicable to the 3 days mentioned before the creation of the heavenly bodies. The sun was only created on the 4th day, of course. Since the sun was not created at the time, the word day would not apply to the previous days if taken in the solar sense, in the normal solar literal sense. Besides, and I quote again, for the whole 24 hours of the sun's circuit, there is always day in one place on earth and night in another. It's not worldwide. And then for him, conclusive almost, God's making could not possibly occupy a day, nor should God's rest be measured by the sun. More fundamentally, however, the story told in chapter 1, if interpreted literally, is not consistent with that presented in chapter 2. There are many inconsistencies between them, as I'm sure you've noticed yourselves. God is said to have finished his works at the end of the first account, but then the second account appears to begin the process all over again, and in a different sequence this time. After the creation of heaven and earth comes, quote, the green things of the field before they appear above the earth. And Augustine makes much of the fact that life is still in seed as the second account opens. Next comes the first man, though man was already said to have been created in the first account. And then there is no mention of women at this point, though they have already, woman has already been said to be created in the first chapter. Animals and birds are mentioned next, and then finally, at the end of the story, woman, who is created now again, it seems. What can the author have meant by these two altogether disparate accounts of origins? That's the problem that he faced. And indeed, just in parentheses, I won't go into this, contemporary exegetes, or indeed exegetes for several centuries, have taken on the obvious disparity between the two chapters and located them 4 centuries apart, the chapter 2 being 4 centuries earlier than chapter 1. Augustine took the two stories to constitute a single narrative from a single author, Moses. In his view, they must have been intended to address 2 different aspects of the creation act. The first is God's instituting the initial state of the universe. The second is the subsequent working out of the potentials that were already made present in the initial act. From the Creator's perspective, the two are one. From ours, of course, they are temporally distinct. And that's where Augustine's distinctive notion of time comes into play, the handout again. It is idle to look for time, he says, before creation, as if time can be found before time. If there were no motion, there would be no time at all. Motion, change. A creature could not move if it did not exist. We should therefore say that time began with the creation rather than that the creation began in time. Time is in fact the motion of creatures from one state to another, change. Hence, when we think of the first creation of things, we should not think of those days as solar days, nor in time. Rather, he made that which gave time its beginning as he made all things together, a phrase that he quotes from Sirach, quotes very frequently, disposing them in an order based not on intervals of time, and here an important note, but on causal connections. That is, they will come about in the normal causal way, as we'll see. Time itself, Augustine says, is a feature of the created changing universe, a measure of that change. From God's own atemporal standpoint, the creation is a bringing to be of the universe from its first moment to the last in a single act. The 7 days are but one for him, no more than a single timeless instant. Viewing the creation's action in that light, it is plausible, though not strictly necessary, I think, to suppose that the potentials would be there from the beginning. At the creation, the universe, as far as possible, receives the capacity from the beginning to achieve what the Creator intends it to achieve. The first day created knew the whole array of creatures, he says, arranged in hierarchical order. Creation was revealed as if in 6 steps called days, and thus was unfolded all that was created. But, he says, in reality, there was only one day. Unquote. Another clue that guides Augustine's interpretation of the first chapter is the significant difference he finds there between two types of creative action. One described by "let there be," and the other by "let it bring forth." The Creator said, "let there be," when speaking of things like the firmament, the separation of waters from dry land, the sun and moon to establish day and night. They were given once and for all. These are features of the universe that are instituted from the beginning. They don't appear gradually, they don't grow. But living things for him are a quite different category. They are, quote, brought forth from earth and water, he says over and over. They must then, in some sense, have been already there, ready to appear later when the conditions of water and earth would be right, a phrase that he uses. The analogy of seeds immediately suggested itself to him. The earth already is known to bring forth from seed the crops and the fruit trees that are mentioned on the third day. Why not extend that analogy and suppose that the earth might bring forth also the beasts of the earth, as he calls them, likewise from seed? These would clearly not be ordinary seeds. Even in the case of the green things of the field, these would first appear not from prior seed, but from seed potentials implanted by the Creator in the dawn universe. To express this in a language that would have been familiar to his hearers, Augustine drew on the Stoic philosophy of his own day. It was the popular philosophy in Rome at that point. The Stoics saw the universe as being in a constant state of making and unmaking, beginning and ending in fire, where seed-like principles, and the phrase they used was rationes seminales, the Latin phrase. And there's no exact, it's a difficult thing to try. Rationes sound like reasons, and seminales, of course, is seed-like. I would call it seed-like principles, or seed-like entities, where they took the universe to be directed by a seed-bestowing divine, though material word fire, as they called it, a logos. Here they used the Greek term quite obvious, a logos spermatikos, a reason or an origin given by seeds. Augustine proposed instead a creator entirely transcending material process who would bring the seed-like agencies to be in the single creative act. Quote, "The motion we now see in creatures measured by the lapse of time as each fulfills its proper function comes to creatures from these rationes seminales implanted in them, which God scattered as seeds at the very moment of creation." And then more specifically, the handout. In the seed then there was invisibly present all that would develop in time into a tree. And in the same way we must picture the world when God made all things together as having had all things that were made in it and with it when the day was made. This includes not only heaven with sun, moon, stars and earth, but also the beings which water and earth produced in potency and in their causes before they would come forth in the course of time, unquote. In his work, the De Trinitate, Augustine develops this thought further. The Creator must have conferred a generative power on the elements from the beginning. Quote, I haven't included all of these quotes, I didn't want to make the handout too long. He says, all these creatures by way of origin have already been created in a kind of texture of the elements, but they come forth when they get the opportunity, unquote. The presence of this generative power comes to be known, quote, although we are unable to see it with our eyes, yet we can conjecture its existence by our reason. For unless there was some such power in those elements, there would not so frequently be produced from the earth things which had not been seen there, nor yet so many animals that themselves spring up without any union of parents. The ancients were very much aware of things like appearing worms and caterpillars and so on appearing as though from nowhere. But it's important, he says, to distinguish ordinary seeds from the original ones which gave rise to the later seeds, the living kinds. Quote, again, for those seeds which are visible now to our eyes from fruits and living things are quite distinct from the former seeds, which at the bidding of the Creator, the water produced the first swimming creatures and fowl, and the earth, the first buds after their kinds, and the first living creatures after their kinds. But oftentimes, suitable combinations of circumstances are wanting whereby they may be able to burst forth and complete the species. So the environment is what's crucial here. They have to wait the right moment of water and earth. That's the way he puts it. A critical text for him was that of the sixth day, where God is said to have, quote, finished the works that he had made. There must then be a real sense in which the work of creation could be said to be complete at that point, but only if the seeds of all that will come later are already present from the beginning can this be true. The works are then finished in the sense that the bringing to be from nothing is now complete. What is left is their development over the course of time, and this will begin in the second Genesis account with the story of man, the appearance of the first man, the role assigned to him in the Garden of Eden, the appearance of the injunction laid on him, his own naming of the animals, who were assumed to have appeared earlier, of course, and finally the making of a partner who would, as it said, complete him. Augustine sees this as the best way to resolve the tension between the two biblical narratives. It is also implicitly, and this is important, closer to his own understanding of the act of creation itself. The two narratives recount an act that manifests itself to us in two quite different ways. The initial act of bringing to be the universe and all the potentialities that are required for later development, and the subsequent working out over time of all that was originally contained potentially, with an emphasis in that second account on those things which are of most consequence to us, the Garden of Eden, for example. To the Creator, these two acts are one. To us, temporal beings, they appear to us as creation and conservation. To what extent are the tensions in the text actually resolved? Augustine worried about several difficulties that remain. First, the operation of these seed-like agencies are of a completely unfamiliar kind. Of that rule them out? No, he says. After all, we don't even know what permits ordinary seeds to grow as they do, into what, even in our own bodies, what it is that makes us grow old. The nature of this latter process, growing old, is hidden from us. Again, the handout. But by another kind of knowledge, we conclude that there is in nature some hidden force by which latent forms are brought into view. The principle which makes this development possible is hidden to the eyes, but not to the mind. Our minds can reason to the presence in nature of latent processes of all kinds, even though we don't see them or fully understand them. But there is a much more serious difficulty, and it comes to the fore when he discusses the problem, the formation of the first man. Quote, "In what state did God make man from the slime of the earth? Did he make him a fully developed man as an adult, or as an infant, as he makes human beings today in their mother's wombs?" Though Augustine doesn't really dwell on the difficulties facing either option, they are sufficiently obvious, recalling that in either event, the first man is developing naturally from a seed principle implanted in the earth in the initial creation. The same difficulty would come up for animals in general, but Augustine poses it in what for him is the most problematic case, the human. The seed metaphor works much better for plants, which require only the requisite conditions of earth and water to grow to their maturity. But animals, on the other hand, require a period of nurturing. Interestingly, Augustine does not take the biblical text to authorize a special kind of making for man, one that involves God in a different way than in the case of animals. Both, he insists, are made from the earth. Quote, "The same scripture that says that God formed man from the slime of the earth says also that he formed the beasts of the field from the earth." Unquote. The distinction between man and animal lies elsewhere, he says, in the fact that man is made in God's image. He has been endowed with intellect, quote, by which he surpasses the beasts, unquote. And then he goes on, in either case, whichever way God made Adam, he did what was in accordance with his almighty power and wisdom. God has established in the temporal order fixed laws governing the production of kinds of beings and bringing them forth from a hidden state into full view. But his will is supreme over all. By his powers he has given numbers to his creation, but he has not bound his powers by those numbers. Now, I don't have time to develop that notion of numbers, but in fact, when Augustine talks about numbers, he means the laws, as we would call them today, the ways, the characteristic ways in which nature operates. Already in Augustine's day, it was known that numbers, this came from astronomy mainly, that the numbers would be the way to characterize that. But as he says here, he was not necessarily bound by these numbers. Now, this is a critical concession which actually is almost always lost by those who reported on this text. Faced with the difficulty of conceiving how Adam, and by implication animals generally, could originate from seeds implanted in the earth, Augustine allows that there are two possibilities. They may be brought about through the fixed laws or the numbers governing the created world, even if the particular laws proper to the seed principles are unknown to us, or they might be brought about simply in a miraculous fashion. God has not, as he says, bound his powers by the laws, and thus may on occasion transcend them by way of what we would call miracle. But in the latter case, should one still describe this in the language of seeds? He had said, as we've seen, that in the seeds there was invisibly present all that would come later to develop in time, unquote. Has he not abandoned his original commitment in requiring the potentialities from which the natural kinds later develop to be present in the waters and earth of the original creation? Augustine thinks not. Even if God were to form Adam miraculously, he would still do so from the earth of the first creation, and so there would have been a potentiality of some kind in that earth from the beginning to permit a miracle to take place. Later, medieval commentators will call that an obediential potency in the context. Why should it not be described, he says, in terms of seed principle, in line with his original insistence that the potentiality for man, and by implication for other animals, had to have been an effective reality in the first creation? And if this be conceded, quote, I think this is in the handout, why can we not assume that the seed principle had both potentialities, so that from them would come whatever would have pleased the Creator? That is, the Creator could choose between these two possibilities. It should be added that in his view, a miraculous coming to be of the first human body could still be described as natural. Quote, when events like this happen, they do not happen against nature except for us who have a limited knowledge of nature, but for God, for whom nature is what he has made. So this is where Augustine leaves it. The extreme difficulty of imagining the sort of fixed laws of nature that could conceivably bring about the first appearance of man, presumably as an adult, have led him to qualify his original insight and to allow at least the possibility that God might have chosen to bring man about, and animals possibly, miraculously, identifying as a seed-like reality, a ratio seminalis. The possibility that God might have done that in the first creation tends, however, to undermine the original seed metaphor. Crucial to it was his claim that the kinds that came afterwards had to have been present in some real sense in the earth and waters of the first creation. If man and the other animals were present only in the sense that the possibility of their being was later miraculously created was true from the beginning, this does not really qualify as seed-like, as a real generating principle. More seriously, the difference between this version and the literal reading of Genesis 1 that would have God bringing the different kinds to be in a miraculous fashion, that's the literal way of reading the 6 days. the difference between them seems to diminish, if not to vanish. The lesson we can draw from this, however, to finish, need not, however, be stated in a hedged fashion. The best interpretation, to my mind, of the first chapters of Genesis in Augustine's view was that from our perspective there were two creations, and the instantaneous bringing to be of the material universe containing the seed-like principles that would eventually yield all living kinds, the human body included, and the other, the working out in time when the conditions of earth and moisture permitted of all that was contained in seed-like potency in the first creation. This working out would call on the regularities, the fixed laws, as he once called them, of the natural world, including ones entirely unknown to us. But where those would not suffice, God could bring forth the desired result in a miraculous way. It seems fair to conclude from all this that Augustine's own favoured solution was that miracle would not, in fact, be necessary, so that one could confidently say that man and the other animals were present in a straightforwardly real sense in the first instantaneous creation. After all, he had introduced this discussion by saying, an important saying, I think, quote, it is our business here to seek in the account of Holy Scripture how God made the universe, not what he might produce in nature or from nature by a miraculous power. That's important. That is, our business is to interpret it not by introducing a miraculous power. But the serious difficulty of imagining how the first man, and implicitly the first animals, could conceivably develop from the earth in a seed-like and law-like fashion forced him to retain the option, unwillingly retain the option, I would say, of miracle in reserve, as it were, though doing so stretched the metaphor dangerously close to breaking point. Now, to move on, I have to move quickly here because it's a very long story to tell, and I can only hit parts of it. I'll jump right away. There are intermediates between Augustine and Aquinas, but I'll leave them aside. Aquinas stayed quite close to Augustine's original interpretation of the Genesis account. He discussed it in some detail in two of his works. The first of these, one that's often not noted, was his early commentary on the sentences, where he, quote, sustains with Augustine, unquote, that the 6 days are in reality only one, the division into 6 marking 6 different, for Augustine, not as a matter of fact, for Aquinas. The division into 6 meant the different levels of complexity of the universe, of the created world. They were not divisions of time for Aquinas. And he emphasizes, Aquinas did, quote, here in the handout, as regards the way and the order in which the world was made, such matters, insofar as they are handed down in Scripture, do not pertain to the faith concept per accidens. The same church fathers have handed down a variety of views on such matters, preserving the truth of Scripture in various ways, unquote. Aquinas allows for a multiplicity of interpretations there, and he goes on, again, handout. Where Ambrose takes the 6-day account literally, Augustine maintains that at the very beginning of creation, some things, such as the elements, the heavenly bodies, the spiritual substances, were distinguished according to their species in their own nature, but others, such as animals, living things, plants and human beings, only in their specific rationes seminales, in their seed-like principles. All those later things were produced in their own natures, later in that work by which God, after the 6th day, guides nature. This is the order of nature, which was already established. The way of guiding nature, which was already established by him. That is the natural way of doing it. That is, they were produced from earth and water later. In the initial creation, some things were already produced in their fullness. Aquinas' list includes the elements, which are not mentioned by Augustine. In the Aristotelian natural philosophy of the day, the 4 elements were the basic materials from which all else derives. Since there was nothing more basic than they, from which they could from which they could proceed. Aquinas saw them as necessarily the product of the first creation. Implanted in them were the seed-like principles from which the living kinds would later develop in the established ways of nature. He describes these principles as active and passive powers with which the elements themselves came to be endowed, sufficient to bring new kinds to be. These were in addition to the more familiar powers required for the regular functioning of the particular nature. In Aquinas' first reading of Augustine, then, the powers that animated the formation of the first man were just as much part of nature as those that direct the normal processes. It was not a matter of a miraculous act on God's part. He mentions that it is the power that it lies in the semen of a lion or a horse. Interesting comparison. The operation of the ratione seminalis in bringing about the body of the first man, as well as the first in each animal kind, did not then, it would seem, call for miracle on the Creator's part. Aquinas does not mention the difficulties that troubled Augustine about how a seed-like process could give rise to an adult animal, and his subsequent concession that perhaps in that context it might require miraculous assistance. One might have expected an Aristotelian like Aquinas in natural philosophy to resist this whole notion of ratione seminalis, which certainly are not very much Aristotelian in origin. But we find Aquinas preferring Augustine's interpretation of the Genesis chapters, even though the latter, quote, is more widely held and superficially seems more consonant with the text. That is, he prefers it to the account, I should say, of Ambrose. Ambrose stuck to the literal interpretation there, but Aquinas says that he prefers the Augustinian one, even though the other is superficially more consonant with the text. An interesting phrase. Augustine's quote is more reasonable and better protects Scripture from the derision of the infidel, which Augustine, in regard to his own interpretation of Genesis, teaches is especially to be considered. His opinion, and this is the final phrase, he says, Augustine's opinion is more pleasing to me. That's his final say. Now that's in the commentary on the sentences, his early work. But he returns to this topic later on in the Summa Theologica. Throughout the section, the long section on the work of the 6 days in that work, Augustine's view is treated with great respect, though Aquinas nowhere mentions the distinctive ratione seminalis that he had acknowledged in his earlier work and that were a critical component in Augustine's interpretation. He's at some pains to argue that the divergence between Augustine's and the more widely shared literal interpretation is not as deep as it seems. According to Augustine, he says, again, quote, all the days that are called 7 are one day represented in a sevenfold aspect, while others consider that there were 7 distinct days. Now, these two opinions, taken as explaining the literal text of Genesis, are certainly widely different as interpretations. If, however, they are looked at as referring to the mode of production, obviously the same, God, Creator, they will be found not greatly to differ. But this, he does admit, leaves some real differences between the two interpretations. The others hold that plants and animals were produced actually in the work of 6 days, over 6 days. Augustine, that they were produced potentially, unquote. Augustine and the others disagree on the ordering of the various features of the created universe, his ordering being based on the natures involved, the others on the time of appearance. Augustine, quote, takes the earth and water as first created to signify matter totally without form, unquote, leaving the impression of form upon matter to a second stage, whereas the other writers take the earth and water to be fully formed. It takes the earth from the beginning. Aquinas ends his review, this is different from the first time around, in order therefore to be impartial, we must meet the arguments of both sides. This time he doesn't therefore endorse the Augustinian interpretation outright over its rival. He leaves it up to the reader to decide between them. It's interesting that he doesn't discuss the exegetic case, the exegetic reasons and the reading of the Bible that Augustine so carefully built up in support of his own way of surmounting the evident tensions between the two different stories of creation. He does, however, remind his readers more than once that Augustine is not calling on miracle to carry through the needed potentialities. And here an interesting quote. Augustine remarks that in the first founding of the order of nature, we must not look for miracles, but for what is in accordance with nature, unquote. So much then for Aquinas. Now, much more briefly, Bonaventure, his great contemporary and often rival, when Aquinas first started to teach as a young man at the University of Paris, Bonaventure's students picketed his courses. He was regarded as a pagan Aristotelian for a time until he won them over. So Bonaventure and he had been rivals, in a manner of speaking at least. Bonaventure asks, was the first matter created not yet perfectly formed, or was it fully formed from the beginning? That was his way of describing the debate in his commentary on the sentences, again, his work on the sentences of Peter Lombard. The former was the view of those who held that 6 days were needed to complete the task, whereas defenders of the latter held that the work was complete from the start, complete with the inclusion of the Ratione Seminales, of course, which he doesn't mention. Now, the handout. Some of the fathers prefer the theological way in this matter, drawing support from those things which are of the faith. So they emphasize the faith and the theology. Others, principal among them, Augustine, prefer to follow the philosophical way, relying on those things which seem more consonant with reason, drawing confirmation of their reasoning from their understanding of Scripture. So where one side begins from Scripture and stays with Scripture, the other side begins from reason and then faces the problem of containing it within Scripture. That's his way. That certainly wasn't Aquinas' way of dealing with it. To continue with that, thus, since it seems more reasonable for supreme power to produce all things together, and that interposing time delays is neither useful nor necessary, they hold that all things were produced together, confirming their view by appealing to the authority of Scripture. They deal with what seems to contradict their view, namely the distinction of the 6 days, by showing that these days are not material but spiritual, which can allow all things together. This position, he says, is highly rational and quite subtle. Now that isn't, of course, quite the way that Augustine presented it, but it's very interesting to me that Bonaventure, in a sense, picks out something here, that the merit of Augustine's view in part rests on reason, that the way in which a transcendent creator would operate would clearly not be to separate it out in bits and pieces, a mosquito here and an elephant there, but rather to do everything in principle at the beginning and allow his nature to take his own established nature to take over at that point. Bonaventure sees that, philosophically speaking, or as he says, the work of reason, is the more reasonable point of view. To move a little bit past on this, in the end, Bonaventure is a little reluctant to go that way himself. He is content to let Augustine's interpretation stand as a possible sense, but as for himself, he finds the literal way of reading the 6 days, quote, to be more probable on scriptural grounds. And then he adds, even though the other seems to be more consonant with human reason, which is an interesting contrast. He cites Augustine himself in support of his own way of doing it, since Augustine once says in the commentary on Genesis, quote, that the authority of Scripture is greater than that of any human perspicacity, so that it trumps human reason. So Bonaventure takes a different point of view than Aquinas did. Now, this ends my layout of the Augustinian interpretation. Much more could be said about it. I want to turn now to the second part, unfortunately abbreviated, of my remarks. What on earth happened? Well, The story is a quite interesting one. I think I have to tell it in rather abbreviated form. The proclamation of Scripture alone as the rule of faith by the Protestant reformers in the early 16th century, we heard about it this morning from Peter, did not of itself mandate a turn to the literal where the Bible was concerned, but if individuals were expected to discover from their own reading the intended meaning of biblical texts, the literal meaning was likely to be favored. Not only would allegory be banished, but more abstract construction of problematic texts would automatically be suspect. Now, if Peter won't mind something that he talked about this morning, I quote here, "With the new biblical literalism which followed in the wake of the Reformation, many portions of Scripture were read for the first time as having history as their primary sense." An interesting point. The significance of narrative passages of the Bible now lay in the fact that they recounted things that had happened hundreds or thousands of years ago, whereas the accounts of creation in the book of Genesis had provided scope for the imaginations of exegetes given to allegory, although Augustine wouldn't allow his to be allegory, I would say. Now the significance of these stories was seen to lie in the literal truth depicting past events. Moses became the sacred historian who had written a factual account of the first ages of the earth, the significance of which was historical, not figurative or allegorical. The contents of the book of Genesis attracted new descriptions, quote, "the history of creation, the history recorded by Moses," unquote. Augustine's reading of the first chapters of Genesis was in fact not allegorical, but neither was it straightforwardly historical. It was in the first instance an attempt by a gifted and widely read scholar to discover a coherent way of reading a puzzling sacred text, not a straightforward one. Now, we can turn first to John Calvin. Calvin is interesting on this. John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis, offers a striking contrast with the earlier hexameral. The word hexameral, 6th day in Greek, is often used as the adjective describing this whole tradition back to Augustine and beyond, the discussion of the 6 days, the hexameral literature. In his lengthy construal of the work of the 6 days, he goes into it in great detail. There is not a single reference to any earlier author, not one. This is the work of an enormously learned scholar who entirely from his own resources sets out to discover what the literal meaning of the famous text is. He leaves the reader in no doubt as to what he thinks of one particular errant reading, that of Augustine. Quoting Calvin. "Here the error of those is manifestly refuted who maintain that the work was made in a moment. For it is too violent a cavil to contend that Moses distributed the work which God perfected at once into 6 days for the mere purpose of conveying instruction. Let us rather conclude that God himself took 6 days for the purpose of accommodating his works to the capacity of man. Nor had the earth a germinating principle from any other source till the mouth of the Lord was opened," unquote, on the 3rd day. Though he doesn't say so, he actually doesn't mention Augustine here. He elsewhere, of course, has great faith in Augustine. But it's clear that, of course, it's Augustine's construal that he is dismissing here. When he comes to the Bible passages where living creatures are said to be brought forth from the waters, he notes that this can still qualify as creation from nothing, that is creation proper. This is curious. Quote, "Not that the beginning of their creation is to be reckoned from the moment in which they receive their form later, but because they are comprehended in the universal matter which was made out of nothing." So he now is making a distinction between the original matter, which is what was created, and the form which is applied later. So that as respect to species, form only was added to them, but creation is nevertheless a term truly used respecting both the whole and the parts, unquote. Now there are obvious echoes of Augustine here, prompted by the bringing forth metaphor. In order to have all of the living kinds that would come later already contained somehow in that first creation, which is the creation ex nihilo proper, Calvin points out that the matter from which their forms will later be miraculously imposed. Now that's of course the difference with Augustine. The later act of imposing a form on the matter is going to be miraculous, and it will be over 6 days. That was already part then. Where Augustine secures the original presence of the living kinds by means of seed-like principles, each to a particular kind, Calvin does so more tenuously by invoking a generic matter to be individuated miraculously only later. Now, there was an even more marked turn to the literal on the side of the Counter-Reform, a point that's often forgotten. The norms governing the proper interpretation of Scripture were one of the main concerns of the Counter-Reform Council of Trent. The fourth session of the Council in 1546 decreed that interpretation should be governed by the authority of the Church and, quote, the unanimous consent of the Fathers, unquote. There was no mention of the literal here, but the divisions regarding the Scriptures that were at the heart of the bitter controversy between the two sides, the Reform and the Counter-Reform, led to a new conservatism in interpretation on the Counter-Reform side also. Now, there are several striking examples. This would lead me in a totally different direction, but I mentioned Bellarmine, who was so much involved at all levels of the Galileo, well, not all, most levels of the Galileo case. Bellarmine is another documented example right from his first teaching in Louvain in the 1570s. But I'll talk here rather about Francisco Suarez, who lived 1548-1617. He was perhaps the most eminent Catholic philosopher theologian of that period. His Tractatus de Opere Sixtiarum, a tract on the work of the 6 days, which was published posthumously in 1622, was a mighty work running to 5 books and 447 double-column pages. Surely one of the most exhaustive treatments of the topic in the entire hexameral tradition. Unlike most other commentators, he focuses his discussion of Augustine's view mainly on the latter's exegetical analysis of the Genesis chapters, vigorously deploring its departure from the literal, deploring from beginning to end. He traverses the Genesis text, Suarez does, line by line almost, with frequent reference to other parts of Scripture, and draws on scholastic philosophy, of which he was a master, unsparing in his criticism of what he perceives to be logical inconsistencies in Augustine's reading of Scripture. He leaves the reader in no doubt whatever as to his uncompromisingly negative view of Augustine's construal of the 6 days, as well as of Cajetan, a contemporary who was supportive of Augustine. He's very hard on Cajetan also for that reason. He insists, for example, that the Genesis description of the 6 days uses expressions that can only be understood in terms of temporal succession. The transitions from day to night and from morning to evening, on which the whole account depends, Suarez says, makes no sense unless time passes. And he concludes that this way of reading the passage that Augustine had adopted, he said, is foolish and insufficient, quoting him. If the creation of all at the first instance is to be rejected, as he urges, there should be no need, he says, to introduce Augustine's ideas about seed-like principles. These aren't necessary any longer. Still, he feels that some comment on them is called for. And so he says, I quote, "But if someone were to say Augustine does not mean by virtus or potentiality, this sort of seed, the normal sort of seed, but rather another peculiar virtus or ability of earth capable of germinating, this is to be rejected with the same facility with which it is uttered. Why? Because it has no foundation in Scripture. The notion of a rationes seminalis is not quoted in the Scripture. That size for him settles it. Nor can it be explained in a natural way. Augustine himself had difficulties with that, as we saw. So, by and large, Suarez, I could go in at more length into this, Suarez at great length simply demolishes the Augustine interpretation, both as inconsistent and of course, as departing from the literal word of Scripture. That was the main point. Now, this sweeping assault on the part of the most influential Catholic theologian of the early modern period would have strongly discouraged, to say the least, later Catholic theologians from expressing interest in Augustine's departure from the now canonical literal sense of the Genesis text. There would still be some supporters right through the ages that followed, but Suarez's extended attack and the prevailing literalism in Scripture interpretation meant that Augustine's view dropped almost out of sight among Catholic exegetes. And now a very quick note. The growing popularity of natural theology in the English-speaking world would not have encouraged the idea that the potential for natural development of the living kinds was present in the first creation. The whole point of the design argument developed by Boyle and Ray, we heard about this morning, was the ordaining of means to end that are so lavishly manifested in the bodily structures and instincts of the animal world require the active interposition of intelligence at the origin of each separate kind. Did the Christian have to choose in the light of this between the rival interpretations of the first chapters of Genesis, supposing him to be aware that there was even a question here, they would surely, those supporting natural theology, would almost certainly have opted for the literal reading. Now, to conclude in the few minutes I have, I'll give a quick sketch of the rather extraordinary end of the story. Jumping ahead to Darwin. It's not in the least surprising then that the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species did not find theologians rushing to point out that there was a precedent for the notion of evolution understood as gradual development, not of course in the Darwinian sense, within the Christian tradition. The specifically Darwinian contribution, natural selection, was of course entirely new, but it would not have been far-fetched to regard it as solving a problem that Augustine had so long worried about. Now, his book called forth a great many reviews, and one review that appeared almost immediately in the Catholic journal, The Tablet, which incidentally was being edited by John Henry Newman, by someone who called himself by his initials, R.S. We know now that there was someone called Richard Simpson. Simpson essentially, to summarize his point of view, he is quite critical of Darwin's notion of natural selection as insufficient to bring about all of the changes that would be needed over evolution. But he's entirely supportive of the notion of evolution itself. And basically what he says is, what's the big deal? We've known about this since Augustine's time. So he goes back to Augustine, I think via Aquinas. I don't think he'd read Augustine, but he had read Aquinas. And so he goes right back to Augustine and says, well, we knew this all along. I mean, what's this, all this nonsense about Darwin's novelty and so on? His novelty is natural selection, and it's wrong. But evolution itself is a commonplace in the Christian tradition. Now that, of course, is stretching quite a bit. It was not a commonplace. Okay, that was Simpson. But that was not the main thing that happened. 10 years later, St. George Mivart, one of the great naturalists of that time, Mivart wrote his Genesis of Species. You take the title to copy the one of Darwin. And of course, it was a sustained criticism of Darwin. That is, it supports the notion of natural selection as a partial way of explaining particularly micro changes, but it's entirely unsupportive of the larger changes, the macro changes in the evolutionary tradition, and argues that something much different will be needed. And what he tends to say, he favors internal goal-directed forces responsible for the progress and for convergence on recurrent structural forms. So he wants to introduce some directive notion, which of course is going to be interpreted by most as involving God. But at any rate, Mivart then is once again, is entirely supportive of the notion of evolution, as Simpson had been, wants to say that natural selection is okay, but it's not enough, and that you require much more in the way of directivity. But then he makes an absolutely fatal mistake. It's one of the great mistakes, I think, in history almost. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating here. Myvert, to support his point of view, quotes who? Suarez, the greatest critic of Augustine in the entire history of the Augustinian interpretation. He obviously hadn't read Suarez, although Myvert quotes him in Latin. This was a different set of readers, I think, in the 1870s. A long paragraph in Latin didn't deter them, apparently. But he quotes Suarez, and undoubtedly it had been given him by a friend, a Catholic friend possibly. And it was a minor point about substantial change that actually really did not make the point that Myvert thought it did. But to support him, he presents Myvert as a major spokesman for the Catholic Church, even at the present time. Okay, so here is Myvert, who is, in fact, was a major critic of Augustine, being quoted as the authority to be followed on this minor point. Okay, it didn't take long for disaster to strike. Waiting in the wings was Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, so self-described. He decided to take on the review of this book, and of course is a great defender of Darwin, but he checked on Suarez, or someone checked for him, and again he's quoting in Latin. And of course what he discovers is that Myvert, that Suarez, far from being a supporter of Augustine, was its most avid, its most aggressive critic. And so he says, here we have an aggressive critic being quoted, and the aggressive critic is said to speak for the Catholic Church. So that means the Catholic Church is clearly against Darwinian evolution, which we know scientifically to be the case. We know that it's right. Of course, Huxley strongly believed that. So the Catholic Church, once again, is on the wrong side. And of course, those of you who know Thomas Henry Huxley know that that was a rather permanent message of his. So he had a beautiful riposte here in terms of undermining Myvert's. He's able to quote Suarez as himself rejecting the Augustinian interpretation, and he takes Myvert to be largely dependent on the Augustinian interpretation for his own opposition to Darwin. And the implication is that Myvert's opposition to Darwin was largely prompted by a non-stated Catholic or Christian prejudice. So Myvert's entire approach is suspect. Huxley does not discuss actually his specific criticisms of natural selection. He rather says this whole thing, this opposition on Myvert's part to Darwin, is clearly prompted by his Christianity, and as we all know, Christianity and Catholicism, he said specifically, is anti-science. So, needless to say, that sank the Augustinian interpretation, if any sinking was needed. It's hardly surprising then, because in England particularly, for anyone at that point to have quoted Augustine in support would undoubtedly have read to the riposte that this was a kind of Christian or even specifically Catholic way of approach, which had been refuted by Darwin. It was a disaster really, and it was brought about by the injudicious quote on Myvert's part. So it took 30 or 40 years for anyone writing in this country in English to quote Augustine again. Messenger was the first, I think, in the 1920s. At least I haven't found others writing it, certainly not at any length on him. There were other writers in the years that followed. I don't have time to discuss them, There were 4 separate books over the next 40 years. That's all. One by a man called Leroy in France, Dalmas Leroy, a Dominican. And it was only in a later edition that he realized that Augustine was to be quoted. But one I'm rather proud of is my, I might say, colleague, John Zam of Notre Dame, was the first book in English who extensively discusses the Augustinian approach and supports really the Mivart interpretation of Darwin, the Mivart interpretation of evolution. That was in the 1890s. And there were 2 more, one from the University of Louvain in Belgium, a geologist called de Dorledo. But finally, and most effectively, the book that when I was a graduate student I read so enthusiastically, Ernest Messenger, English Jesuit. His book, for me, I must say, had a huge influence when I was a student long ago. That book appeared in the 1930s in support of evolution. What's it called? Augustine. It's a very detailed account of the whole Augustinian tradition, much more detailed than I've given here. Okay, now I should end by just asking a question. The question is, why should we be even interested in this issue today? What's the relevance of it? Why should we still hark back to Augustine when discussing the response of the contemporary Christian, like many here, or the contemporary, incidentally, the contemporary Muslim also, because much of this will apply to the Quran. After all, the specifically exegetic case that Augustine made for his dramatic version of cosmic origins, though it was ingenious, was in the end, as modern exegetes would argue, was insufficient. A much more consistent way of dealing with the textual discrepancies has long been accepted. But the fact of the discrepancies no one disputes today. But well, I shouldn't say no one, but his version of origins itself turned out to be prescient, anticipating the dazzling vision of a universe billions of years old, in which the seeds of all the living things that would come later were present in that first cataclysmic moment. Augustine's case was flawed, but his version of origins was not. This might make it seem as though he stumbled on that version by accident, but it was no accident. As later commentators like Bonaventure have realized, underlying the exegetic argument was another, more persuasive one, largely left unexpressed. Augustine saw the transcendent creator as one who would not defer essential tasks until later, to be accomplished only by supplementing, by way of miracle, the natural processes that were already set in place at the beginning. He and Aquinas agree that, quote, in the first founding of the order of nature, we must not look for miracles, but for what is in accordance with nature, unquote. From that principle, it would follow that the potentiality for all the kinds that would come later would be contained in the nature of the first beginning, in the matter of the first beginning, capable of bringing forth those kinds in accordance with nature. Once this be accepted, the task is to reconcile that insight with Scripture, and that's what Augustine set himself out to do, while at the same time respecting another of his principles, that in case of conflict, the Scripture must come first. He would say, of course, that there was no conflict. The import of all of this for Christians today, and I think for a broader audience than that, the fundamental insight of the Christian doctrine of creation that goes back to, and that of course is also in many ways the Jewish and the Muslim, it's the one in Islam also, that goes back to Augustine and beyond, is that the order of nature was complete from the beginning. Not only does this not conflict with contemporary evolutionary understanding of cosmic origins, it requires a solution along those very lines. Augustine struggled to fend off the principal objection to his view that the first in a line of complex animals could not possibly come to be in a single step and in a natural way from a seed principle locked in the earth. As we now know, even more than he did, there is no such way. That he should even consider so implausible a suggestion testifies to his confidence that the Creator would somehow find a way. And indeed, the Creator did. Darwin and his collaborators pointed to that way. It was not to be accomplished in a single step, as Augustine had thought, but in descent with modification through a countless series of living ancestors. Augustine would surely have been thrilled could he have known that his confidence that there had to be a way was not misplaced. In that respect, Darwin, without realizing it, had gone a long way towards securing the eventual validation of the core beliefs that animated that other Christian tradition. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ernan. If we have some time for questions and discussion, we'll start right at the back. Yes, yes, Andy.
Forgive my academic.
I'll go back. My hearing's not good.
Yeah.
So
Neither is
let me get
mine.
close to you here.
You can speak up when you ask
Yeah.
your questions. That will be helpful.
Yeah.
Last speaker, yes.
Forgive my academic naivete, but it sounds so much like this discussion totally is our efforts, the human efforts, to put limits on God. So the literalist says it can only happen according to the Genesis. The philosopher says that it can only happen according to what would affirm our logic, and the scientists say it can only happen according to what occurred in the first 30 seconds of the Big Bang. It seems like we're putting limits on a God that has no limits.
Well, the simple answer to that, I think, from my point of view, would be to say that Augustine specifically, what you say is indeed all too true in many contexts. I would agree with that. But what Augustine was precisely doing was denial of limits. He was saying that the kind of creator, he had done a lot to work out the notion of creation ex nihilo, which actually had been in formation for a long time. That's a different story. But in that creation ex nihilo, it means that the creator is entirely free, is not bound in any way, can make any kind of creation that the creator wishes. There's absolutely no limit set. God can make whichever kind of universe. And the only, if you like, limit, if you would, I don't know if you would want to call this a limit, the only kind of restriction here that we also know that the creator had an intention. Words like intention are, I think, misleading here. Any human name applied to God is not appropriate, but it's the best we can do. Anyway, an intention to bring about within that universe a creature who could, in fact, freely accept or deny God's power. That was a risk that God took, for whatever reason. He might very well have made a universe within which there would be no creature that could contradict, no creature that could sin. That would have been a very comfortable universe for God, I suppose. But for some reason that we have no business trying to define, I think, God decided to take the risk of placing within that creation an animal who, after billions of years, after many billion years of cosmic history, would in fact at some point become sufficiently complex and sufficiently aware of moral responsibilities that the notion of sin would become at some point applicable, possibly a very long time ago. That's an interesting question for theologians. But at any rate, that is the only sort of restriction. And what's interesting about the Augustinian version of that is to say that all of that was contained right from the beginning. It was not a later intrusion. It was not a second thought. It was not something added later on. It was there from the beginning to come when the conditions of water and earth would be right. I mean, that's the phrase that keeps coming up. And so from that point of view, it's not a limitation. It seems to me, it's rather a manifestation of an extraordinary power, and one clear thing about the Augustinian approach here, and it's one which a good many contemporaries are critical of. One of them will be speaking here tomorrow. That Augustine, as he saw it, insisted that time itself is a feature of the universe. It's not a feature of God. And of course, from the point of view of contemporary science, we know that time and space are inextricably linked. So the time is a feature of our universe, I would argue. Just as space is. We take it for granted that space is a feature of the universe, but time is also. This universe is not somewhere else. And it's specifically not God, in my view at least. So that limitation we have to set aside. But again, to return to the point of your remark, I think you make a very important point that some of the great theologians have tried to bring out. Aquinas, as famously towards the end of his life, the rather abrupt end, he died very young, as you know, he had once suggested that one can't be a complete metaphysician until you're 50. At least that's one interpretation of what he said. He died at 49. But he did pretty well in metaphysics all the same. But anyway, at the very end, as I'm sure most of you here know, he said that all his work was just as straw. Because in fact, God was so far beyond human imagining and human language that in the end, silence is possibly the only respectful approach. Well, we wouldn't have a conference if that were the case, and that would be terrible.
Good. I'm sure that there will not be uniform silence here. But who's next to Peter? Yes. So, yeah. Yeah.
Ernan, this is a small technical question, and I've raised this with you once before, but I've actually found the quote. You talked about Suarez,
yes,
and then no one after that. I was wondering if you looked at Mersenne.
No, I have not. But if you have, I'd welcome it.
Well, I'm going to, I think. But what I mentioned to you last time is that
what I said was that I don't. One thing I didn't say, or shouldn't have said if I did, there were people after Suarez. Right. There were, in fact, others, but Suarez is by far the dominant figure in the later tradition. Right. I mean, he's the one that simply swamped. Yeah. Now, there were other defenders of Augustine in the 18th century, for example, several. None of them terribly well known, but I didn't know about Mersenne.
Okay. No, but the other thing, and I'll show you this.
Yeah.
I'll show you this later, but it's in Descartes' Principles, where he talks about, and I can give you the quote here. He talks about, we can demonstrate the stars and the earth and everything which we perceive in this visible world could have sprung forth, as it were, from certain seeds. Mm-hmm. So you've got this Cartesian cosmological picture where he makes reference to seeds.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I remember that. And it's at least possible that he might have known the Augustinian tradition of introducing the notion of a seed. But in the case of Descartes, what you have there is an extremely strong emphasis on simply motion. Everything is going to happen by motion later on. God is not going to intervene in this. Everything is there at the beginning, but what's very interesting about the day, it's absolutely not Augustine. Descartes says if you have this incredible mess of atoms, basically, although he doesn't use that term, mass of material, of matter, moving in all kinds of directions, ultimately the whole thing is going to work out, which I'd much rather have Augustine seeds than that. I mean, to suppose that if you have a disorderly beginning like that, and remember, you don't have a theory of evolution, you don't have the whole notion of descent with modification. So, the Cartesian one, I think, is simply not specific enough.
But I think his point here, and he makes a point about this is consistent with Genesis. I think his point is that it's precisely the seeds that make possible from this random matter in motion to the...
So you think that the seeds then are not simple potentialities of a very general kind for him? Now, if that's the case, I mean, if that's what he means, then indeed that would leave him a little closer to the Augustinian position. I hadn't thought of that, but that's possible, I
I'll
suppose.
need to look more closely.
Yeah, okay.
But we can talk about it.
Right.
Over coffee, please. Yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering, and excuse me if I missed this during your talk, is Augustine, when he's thinking of his seeds, he's still fundamentally committed, isn't he, to species being fixed.
As what?
Species being fixed. There's no concept in Augustine's mind of species changing or animals changing into other animals, that sort of thing. So his seeds, is he suggesting at all that during the history of the world there may be sort of creatures lying dormant in some sense which appear later, or does he think that everything appears at the beginning?
Do you mean Augustine?
Yes.
Yeah. Augustine, you see, he had a conviction. Let's put yourselves in his position. Augustine had a conviction which, as Bonaventure quite rightly suggested, came from a philosophical notion of transcendent creator and how he would operate, and also from his reading of scripture. And he believed that I'll use his own term here, the seeds of all the living things that would come later must have been present. And what allowed him, in a sense, to say that was the notion that Earth brings forth living things. And remember, Earth for him brought forth all kinds of little bugs from nothing. And it was no big problem for Earth to bring forth things. And waters, of course. One interesting thing, by the way, is, and this is in Genesis itself, is that in the work of the 6 days, the fish and the birds are taken together. The fish and the birds were created together, which is rather interesting. I mean, the fish, it wouldn't have seemed as though they come from the waters, but maybe, you know, we don't need to introduce dinosaurs perhaps at this point, but one never knows. At any rate, what I'm saying is this: it's important not to make the mistake that some of the enthusiasts, you might say, people like John Zahm, for example, or Tedor, who wrote up the Augustinian view back in the 1890s and 1910s, it's not as though he has a theory of evolution, or that his account is. It's not as though the animals themselves could change into a different. That's absolutely anathema, or would have been, to Augustine. He was a Platonist, and there is a single form for each living kind, and no departure from that living kind is permitted. Hybrids are necessarily infertile. That was a big deal, that the mules are infertile. So if you try to blend kinds, it won't work. It won't work over time. So Augustine, as a good Platonist, could never have conceived the idea of Darwinian evolution. What he did conceive was some kind of unspecified process whereby an initial potentiality might become a living thing, a fully formed living thing. But what he didn't realize, of course, was that it would take a few billion years to do that. That would never, ever have occurred to him. But what he does have is the notion of development, that the potential is already there, which of course is what we all would say today. The potential was there right from the beginning. There is already in that first microsecond the potential for all that will come later. There has to be. And so, among other things, living things, galaxies, all sorts of strange things we haven't even thought about. We'll be hearing about dark energy later in the week, I suspect. Nobody thought about that until a couple of years ago. And it's still pretty dark, as we'll hear.
Please, yes.
I don't really get exactly what's the meaning of miraculous for Augustine. And I'm also interested in your opinion about this. But as far as I get, if I think like, let's think about Christ stepping on water.
Yes.
It's just like water's having the potentiality of having at one time in the future a property which is against its initial properties of being a liquid that does not usually support this kind of stepping. And is this coherent to this approach? Is this coherent to say that in the future a substance has the properties which in the future are contrary to the initial properties it was endowed.
That issue came up, I think, already today. I would give, I suppose, basically the same answer. Now, one interesting point I should make, I already made it in the talk. Augustine takes a different point of view on that, very different from, let's say, Aquinas, because as I quoted Augustine, for him, miracles are part of nature, because nature is, he says, what God makes. Anything that God makes is nature. And so miracle is already a natural thing, but it's a different kind of natural thing. It's not part of what Aquinas calls the order of nature, that it is not the regularity on which human life and all life depends, of repetition and reliability, basically. You have to have, we already heard this morning, you have to have a reliable universe for anything complex to develop, particularly anything evolutionary to develop. And so, from that point of view, miracle is a disturbance of that. It's a departure from the normal. And the point that I go from Augustine here to Aquinas, which is, I think, a more consistent view, really, in a way, and that is to say that that in the constitution of the universe, God is, of course, the creator is responsible for all that occurs, miracle and everything else. Augustine is right on that. But there are, according to the religious traditions of the West, all three of the major traditions of the West, there are moments in that which are part of the order of grace in the sense that they're part of the Creator's special dipping into time. He dips into time with Moses, he dips into time with Muhammad, he dips into time with Jesus. God, as it were, enters time in each of these three traditions. Treat that in a separate way, in a different way. But in each of these cases, there is a story to be told about God's special relationship with an individual to begin with, and then with a people, and then a broader and broader compass as time goes on. And in the course of establishing that covenant, as it would be for Israel, the order of salvation, as it would be in the tradition, in the Christian tradition, in the process of bringing that about, God will work signs of one or other kind, that for the time of the day, for that particular period, will serve as signs of his work. And there's nothing particularly difficult, there's nothing contradictory about that. It simply means that from the standpoint of the Western religious traditions, God as creator can do that. It's simply a matter of bringing about a different kind of result for reasons that are, as it were, appropriate within a particular religious tradition. I have no difficulty with that at all. There's nothing, it's not anti-scientific, unless a scientist maintains that that's impossible. And that, of course, is not a scientific point of view.
Okay, well, our time is pretty much up. I've got a last little technical question that's been worrying me all this time, actually, since the talk. And that is, Ernan, you said that Professor Zam was your colleague in the University of Notre Dame, but you also then went on to say in the 1890s.
Yes.
That's been worrying me.
Yeah.
We really,
I've been there.
I know that, I just wanted to check on this.
I've been there a very long time. John Zam was a rather remarkable figure in the history of my university. And I will say one last thing about him. John published a book on evolution, and it was a huge success in the United States and to some extent in this country. It was the first major work in the English-speaking world in supporting evolution with a wide reference to Augustine. But unfortunately for him, it was translated into Italian. And of course, that was not a good idea. So in Rome, it attracted very unfavorable attention. There were a number of Jesuit editors of the Civiltà Cattolica, Catholic journal in Rome, who were anti-evolution and so they brought about a requirement on Zam to withdraw the book. But Zam had enough backing, I would say, both in Rome and in the United States, possibly elsewhere, that in fact the church never made it public. It was never made it public that he had been asked to withdraw the book. And there is a recent book edited by Mariano Artigas and others called Negotiating Darwin. It's a very interesting book because Artigas was given access for the first time, Artigas and some others, to the Vatican files by John Paul II back in the 1990s. And what he discovered there, he has done this elaborate study of the Vatican's reaction, secret reactions, you might say, these are unpublished, to evolution over from Darwin onwards, and in particular books like Zam's book. But in point of fact, what the conclusion of that book is that in fact the church never comes out in condemnation, even though there's some pressures. There was a lot of support, but there was also opposition. And I would argue myself that that's what I've called the Galileo effect. They had learned from the Galileo case, I think, and at least I hope they have.
Right, well on that note, let's thank Ernan very much for a really fascinating